Well, let's stay in the region because in neighboring Rwanda, the issue of the M23 rebel group is once again in the spotlight. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he's concerned about credible reports that Rwanda is backing the armed group in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and had sent its own forces into its neighbor's territory. Mr. Blinken also raised concerns about Rwanda's human rights record, including the jailing of Paul Rusesabagina during the last leg of his three-nation African tour.
I also raised serious concerns about human rights. As I told President Kagame, we believe people in every country should be able to express their views without fear of intimidation, imprisonment, violence, or any other forms of repression. That's true whether they're political opponents, human rights defenders, journalists like the ones in this audience, or simply citizens.
Antony Blinken, well, for more on his trip, I'm joined by Arise International correspondent Faith Orr, who's been monitoring his movement from New York. Good to see you, Faith. It does appear as though he's got a bit of a frosty reception in Rwanda following his critical comments about the country. Just remind us of what he said.
Well, I'll take you through the human rights issue that he raised, Charles. And even in advance, he'd been speaking to the family of Paul Rusesabagina, and they had been pushing him to put pressure on Kagame for their father's release. Now, Kagame actually tweeted last night saying, "Things just don't work like that here. He can put pressure on me all he wants." So he's had a bit of a frosty reception because people are sort of saying, you know, here's an American, he's arriving in Rwanda, and of course he's going to criticize our human rights record, you know, the sort of old trope of the US when it comes to African nations. So it's not just Rusesabagina, it is other, you know, things that the military have done, lots of other issues that he is raising as well. But the one main case that he's focusing on and pressuring from the release of is Rusesabagina. And people are actually saying there is a little bit of hypocrisy here because there are accusations that actually US law enforcement helped the Rwandans with the case and with the conviction of the man who, of course, was the inspiration for the film Hotel Rwanda and who was involved in rescuing people during the genocide.
Well, that's very interesting indeed. And what's been the reaction so far, Faith, to Mr. Blinken's comments that Rwanda is supporting M23 rebels in eastern DRC?
So yes, he has raised this again. Now, what he's saying is it's not the US accusing Rwanda of this. It's a select group at the United Nations that have spent a long time looking into this. They have eyewitness testimony. They have, you know, lots of people actually involved on the ground. And they have now these credible reports. They say that Rwanda is backing the M23 rebel group, which is now operating in the neighbouring Democratic Republic of Congo. And they say it's not just a sort of tacit support where they're perhaps allowing them to have bases, but it's a very active support. In some cases, from eyewitnesses who say that when group attacks, they're actually accompanied by Rwandan forces, and not just accompanied, but also Rwandan military is allegedly providing weapons for this rebel group. I mean, obviously there is still upset and unrest with not just the rebel group, but in so-called inaction by the likes of the United Nations, by the US. So people are saying, well, you know, you can come here and criticize, but what are you actually going to do to help us? And the answer appears to be to that not a huge amount during this visit.
And in that context, Faith, I mean, the US involvement in putting pressure on Rwanda will be critical, won't it? I mean, even though Kigali has denied that they are supporting the rebels.
Yes, so Kigali has denied that they're supporting the rebels, and in turn the rebels have denied that they are being supported by Kigali. But Blinken does appear to have achieved one thing, and that is that President Kagame has agreed to meet with Felix Tshisekedi, the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, they did meet last month in Angola. The president there overseeing a sort of tripartite summit, but they have, Blinken has managed to broker this meeting between the two men. It's unclear when that is going to take place, but certainly these talks can only be a positive thing. And that's because Rwanda has accusations of its own that actually Congo is backing its own rebel group, which is attacking Rwanda. And Blinken says, this simply can't continue. If you're both supporting these rival rebel groups, you're both crossing each other's borders, you're both attacking each other, it's really damaging to regional stability, to regional security. And actually, it's the civilians that are paying the highest price in all of this, not the politicians, not the armed groups, the actual people who are trying to live in these areas. And of course, tens of thousands have been injured, displaced, and chased out of their homes, and a lot more killed as well.
Well, absolutely. That's always the case, isn't it? And just before we go, you mentioned the DRC there. How is that country coping with this rising tension and attacks within its borders? I mean, while at the same time saying goodbye to the UN peacekeeping force there, known as MONUSCO.
Yeah, I mean, we know that especially the east of the DRC is struggling to keep a lid. The armed groups are growing, they continue to grow, and there's real anger against the United Nations, against MONUSCO. We saw quite violent riots just recently, because the people there say, actually, these peacekeepers aren't keeping any peace, they're really not doing anything at all. Now, there is a regional force that's going to be put in place, but Congo says it will only allow the regional force into the country if Rwanda isn't part of it. But we know that, the regional countries are trying to form its own force to help Congo take on the M23 rebel group, which has expanded. I think it's trebled the territory between in about 3 months of this year. So they are hugely expanding. It's the most active it's been in years. DRC very much struggling to keep a lid on that. UN not particularly helping. And as you say, they have already announced a sort of gradual departure. That's not going to be a sudden thing. That will take a long time. But it's unclear if this regional force will be able to replace the thousands of UN troops that are in the country, because if they can't keep a lid on it, how can anyone else?
Faith, thank you very much indeed. Faith Orr, Arise International correspondent who's been monitoring developments around the trip of the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Africa.